Welcome back, everyone. It's my privilege and pleasure on behalf of K20, K21 to welcome you here tonight. Thank you for tuning back in. This is the second day of our 2-day symposium, Rethinking the Museum. This evening is devoted to the recent transformations that are shaping many museums around the world. We'll start the evening by presenting video statements by 5 internationally acclaimed museum directors and curators who share their thoughts for a new museum culture. We are delighted and honored to welcome Do-Young Chong from M+ in Hong Kong, Maria Mercedes Gonzalez from the Museum of Modern Art in Medellin, Francis Morris from Tate Modern in London, Anne Temkin from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and Rein Wolfs from the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Following the statements, we're delighted to be hosting a panel discussion about how art museums can meet the challenges of our time. The panel will be moderated by the wonderful Jennifer Higgy, and Jennifer Higgy will be joined by Omar Kulaif from Sharjah Art Foundation, Kuyo Ku from Zeitmokka in Cape Town, Rax Media Collective from New Delhi, and Susanne Gaensheimer, Art Director here at K20, K21. Now, I'd like to thank everyone who made the symposium possible and all our wonderful guests for tonight. I wish us all an inspiring and memorable evening. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Do-Young Chong, and I'm Deputy Director Curatorial and Chief Curator at M+ Hong Kong. First of all, I would like to thank Susanne Gaensheimer for the kind invitation she extended to me to be part of this event, and Vivian Tromer for her communications and guidance along the way. It is indeed a distinct privilege to be together with the esteemed group of colleagues gathered here for the Rethinking the Museum Symposium, albeit remotely and virtually, and to have an opportunity to speak about M+, the new Museum of Visual Culture in Hong Kong, where I have been working for the last 8 years. By the time this recorded statement is published, we will have just announced the date and other details of the museum's grand opening later this year. So the timing couldn't be better for this museum that has long been in gestation and in preparation. The organizers of this event gave me a good pointer, 5 topics to cover in this brief statement. They are origin, collection, architecture, challenges, and vision of M+. I will go in that order. First, origin. M+ is located in West Kowloon Cultural District, a 40-hectare reclaimed land created in the mid-1990s in Hong Kong's Victoria Harbour. The actual project of creating M+, the institution, has been a 15-year-long project. It was around 2006 that a group of professionals and advisors got together to conceive a multidisciplinary museum of contemporary visual culture and gave the concept the name of M+. In 2008, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government created the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority as a public body through an ordinance. M+ is a wholly owned subsidiary of the authority and has its own board of directors and subcommittees who are responsible for providing governance over the institution that is run by the museum management and more than 200 professionals from around the world. Inspired by the DNA of Hong Kong as a modern cosmopolitan city that exemplifies cultural contact and melange, M+ was from its origin given a global mandate and is tasked to propose new perspectives and tell new narratives from this part of the world, which may have long been perceived far or peripheral. What M+ will offer to the world is not only the newness of our research, programs, and collections built from here, but also a vantage point that productively destabilizes many assumptions and decenters the existing canons. As many of you are already aware, there has been a museum building boom in this part of the world, especially in mainland China, for some time now. But M+ is the singular example that has built a clear structure of governance, policies, and procedures that will ensure that the museum is a truly public institution with a permanent collection. Now, second, collection. M+ collections of visual culture are built on three main disciplinary pillars, which are design and architecture, moving image, and visual art, complemented by the interdisciplinary thematic area of Hong Kong visual culture. The collections have been under construction since 2012. The M+ collections are plural and consist of 4 parts. The M+C collection of Chinese contemporary art, which includes 1,510 works from the 1970s to the 2000s. The M+ collection encompassing the rest of visual art, design and architecture, and moving image, which includes now over 6,000 works. The M+ collection archives, which are mostly architectural material and include over 50,000 items in over 80 fonts. And finally, the library's special collection. The M+ collections are widely recognized as the first museum collection of its kind in all of Asia and are already noted for several distinctions. The M+C collection is the world's premier holding of contemporary Chinese art, arguably one of the most significant art historical developments in the last half-century. The broader collections of art, as well as architecture, design, and moving image, not only focus on our immediate regions of Greater China and East Asia, but also cover Southeast and South Asia. Our geographical purview further extends to North America and Western Europe. Both are well represented already, and more attention is now being paid to researching and acquiring works and objects from West Asia, Oceania, and South America. As we build our collections systematically and rigorously in our first decade of collection building, we have tried not to react to what may be considered dominant Western narratives. We believe that established canons have never been pure or monolithic. Minorities, people of color, or foreigners and aliens have always been participating in and shaping those central authoritative narratives. Building a new collection from our vantage point in Hong Kong, rather than in New York, London, Paris, and the likes, we have been exploring concentrically, layer by layer, from near to far, while firmly believing that faraway traditional centers and metropoles are in fact already within us, and vice versa. In the museum's galleries, when we open, these growing, changing collections will be shown in dynamically thematic, rotating exhibitions as the collections continue to evolve. Third, architecture. Now, this leads to the museum's architecture. Herzog and de Meron's design for M+ makes the museum building a ready-made architectural icon, infused with the architect's signature formal clarity and material sensuousness. Facing and surrounded by the world-famous harbors, skylines, and natural topographies of the city, the museum building is a striking landmark with a decisively horizontal platform that stands out from and comments on the verticality that Hong Kong is known for around the world. Of the 65,000 square meters total, 17,000 square meters are dedicated to exhibiting and displaying art and visual culture across 33 galleries and other spaces, most of which are contained in our horizontal podium. Befitting our visual culture identity and mandate, the museum also includes a cinema and other bespoke spaces for moving image experiences. Also a dedicated learning hub and a research center and a soaring light well, our own turbine hall. The building upturns the visitor's expectations from its exterior, marked by a strong form and a radical geometry. Once inside, the building reveals itself through illumination, airiness, and transparency. While the outside is brought into the building in exciting and considered ways, the content inside is also projected transparently to the outside world via our high-powered LED media screen embedded in the facade of the building's tower, measuring 110 meters across and 66 meters high. 4. Challenges. Of course, we're living in interesting times, shall we say, and this is an ambivalent moment for us to be opening a very large museum. In addition to the challenges arising from the global pandemic, which we are all experiencing together, Hong Kong has faced conflicts between differing visions for the future of the city, for the city's governance, and the role it should play within the nation, the wider region, and in the world. It is indeed a crucial period of transition for the city, of reflection on the identity of the city, and of redefining its place in a world that is undergoing massive shifting of relationships and alliances, like moving tectonic plates. Fifth, vision. No one is quite sure of how the coming years will unfold, but there is no doubt that cultural institutions will continue to play more and more important roles in our respective cities, countries, and societies. Our international mandate and global perspectives at M+ remain firm, but we will have to remain agile and adaptive as the world changes massively, and perhaps also irreversibly and fundamentally even. And that perhaps means that we must recommit to making the museum a place as much of inspiration and stimulation as of empathy and well-being. And I believe this is something that is already felt and shared by the colleagues here, as well as others working around the world. Thank you.
El MAM es una entidad privada sin ánimo de lucro ubicada en la ciudad de Medellín. Medellín es la segunda ciudad más importante del país. Una entidad fundada en 1978 por un grupo de artistas y de ciudadanos que en ese momento vio la necesidad de tener un espacio que pudiera acoger el arte y las prácticas artísticas de ese momento. Desde la llegada a Ciudad del Río, el museo empezó a pensar en su proyecto de expansión, un proyecto que tomó en total 6 años y que terminó con la ampliación, con la renovación de todo el proyecto artístico, cultural del museo y por supuesto también con la inauguración de un edificio nuevo, un edificio de 7.000 metros cuadrados que se suma a este edificio en el que estamos, un edificio que incluyó nuevas salas de exposición para la colección permanente del museo, un teatro y otros espacios. Definitivamente el impacto de esta expansión ha sido muy notorio. En el año 2019, antes de la pandemia, el MAM recibió, o más bien participaron en las actividades y en la vida del museo 130.000 personas. Antes de la expansión recibíamos aproximadamente 45.000, 50.000 personas. El museo tiene un esquema de sostenibilidad económica mixto. Recibe un 40% de sus ingresos provienen de proyectos, de patrocinios y donaciones que se hacen en alianza con empresas y fundaciones del sector privado, el 39% ingresos propios, un porcentaje, un 18% de recursos de la Alcaldía de Medellín y el porcentaje restante son recursos del gobierno nacional. El museo cuenta con una colección patrimonial de más de 2.400 obras de arte moderno y contemporáneo, de arte colombiano principalmente, con una diversidad de formatos, de artistas, una concentración muy especial en el arte antioqueño, en el arte local. Y es una colección que se ha conformado definitivamente gracias a las donaciones que han hecho los artistas y una colección además muy, pero muy vinculada a la programación del museo. Nosotros somos un museo firmemente anclado en Medellín, pero definitivamente con una visión cosmopolita de nuestro quehacer, de lo que debemos ofrecer a la ciudad. Trabajar bajo esta perspectiva creo que ha sido una decisión estratégica, pero también una decisión que responde al momento que vive la ciudad, una ciudad que durante muchísimo tiempo vivió aislada, alejada del mundo, y una ciudad que hasta solamente en las 2 últimas décadas se ha abierto más al mundo, y hoy hay mucha más conexión y mucho más interés también del mundo hacia Medellín. Como para todo el planeta, definitivamente este último año y medio ha sido uno de los momentos más exigentes de nuestras vidas. El año pasado el museo estuvo cerrado al público durante 6 meses, y la pandemia, pues ya a estas alturas, digamos que ha tenido distintos momentos. En un primer momento, muchas instituciones culturales nos volcamos muy rápidamente con las herramientas que teníamos a mano. Nos volcamos a lo virtual, a ofrecer contenidos y un poco de alivio a todo ese momento de incertidumbre y desconocimiento que vivía el mundo sobre lo que realmente estaba ocurriendo. Pero a medida que transcurría el tiempo, a medida que pasaban los meses, nosotros como museo nos fuimos tomando mucho más en serio esa reflexión sobre lo digital. ¿Qué significa ser un museo digital? ¿Qué significa, por ejemplo, la mediación digital? Y no solamente qué significa y si debemos o no hacerlo, sino eso cómo se materializa, eso cómo se implementa. Obviamente nos dimos cuenta de que hay muchas experiencias que tienen lugar en el espacio físico que son absolutamente no se pueden traducir literalmente, no se pueden llevar literalmente a otros escenarios o a otras plataformas, que ese contacto directo de una persona con el arte, con el espacio físico, pues es una experiencia que no se reemplaza. Entonces, poco a poco le fuimos dando forma a una nueva programación, una programación virtual. Nos dimos cuenta que algunos programas funcionaban muy bien y que otros definitivamente pues no teníamos las capacidades, los talentos además para hacerlos. Quisimos entrar en diálogo también con los artistas, ver cómo desde la creación y desde la producción los artistas podían o no aprovechar además lo que tenían a mano, porque estábamos en plena cuarentena, en pleno encierro, con muy pocas posibilidades de movilidad. Este sin duda fue uno de los grandes retos del año pasado, ¿no? La reflexión sobre lo digital y esa nueva programación y ese nuevo contacto con unos públicos que a veces son solamente un nombre o solamente un nickname, unos públicos que están en una ventana, unos públicos que no tienen cara, que no tienen cuerpo. Entonces, cómo el museo se empieza a relacionar con esos nuevos usuarios. Otro de los retos fundamentales, pues no solamente un reto de la pandemia, sino un reto de siempre, ha sido la sostenibilidad económica. Por supuesto que la pandemia hizo muy evidente la fragilidad del sistema en el que existimos, la fragilidad del sistema en el que nos movemos y también pues la fragilidad propia de la institución. Hubo muchísimo apoyo, muchísima generosidad, pero eso también nos hizo empezar a replantear y a buscar nuevos esquemas y nuevas formas de sostenibilidad. Otro de los asuntos que quedó muy al descubierto en la pandemia fue, pues particularmente en el caso colombiano, la ausencia de políticas públicas para el sector de museos y para el sector de las artes visuales. En Colombia un poco las agendas culturales han estado pues marcadas, han sido de decisión de los gobernantes de turno, y encontramos que los museos y las artes visuales nunca han tenido un lugar prioritario en esas agendas y en esos presupuestos, y eso definitivamente quedó al descubierto en la pandemia. Cuando tú no tienes una política pública, sucede un momento tan inesperado, una crisis tan inesperada como esta, entonces pues digamos que no hay de dónde agarrarse. Y definitivamente otro reto, otro asunto que quedó al descubierto fue también la ausencia de conectividad en muchas partes, en muchos sectores de la población, para muchas comunidades. Este fue un tema también que, pues, si bien no depende del museo, también nos lo tomamos muy en serio con pequeñas estrategias y con pequeñas actividades como actividades de mediación telefónica. Nos propusimos con nuestra escuela de mediadores poder llegar a través del teléfono, a través del celular, a estas comunidades que estaban pues no solamente aisladas por la pandemia, sino doblemente aisladas por la falta de conectividad. Yo creo que esta ilusión de cambio que nos ha traído la pandemia tenemos que aprovecharla muy seriamente. Para nosotros hay una pregunta pues que siempre ha sido importante a la hora de imaginarnos nuestro proyecto artístico y cultural, y es cómo ser relevantes, cómo poder servir mejor a esta ciudad, a este país y por supuesto a las distintas comunidades. En Colombia acabamos de vivir un momento muy complejo, una crisis política y social que se expresó en marchas y protestas donde los jóvenes tuvieron un rol protagónico y una visibilidad especial. Así que en concordancia con esto que está sucediendo, esa pregunta de cómo ser relevantes es fundamental. Cómo poder hacer más, cómo podernos convertir en un espacio donde se discuten pues, temas que no tienen necesariamente que ver con el mundo del arte, sino más con el debate político, con los asuntos sociales que son fundamentales para esta sociedad, para este país, que se puedan discutir de manera tranquila, de manera segura, que nosotros como museo le podamos dar también a los públicos las herramientas para que estén mejor informados y para que puedan tener un criterio y un pensamiento crítico frente a otros asuntos. Finalmente, el reto de trabajar con el sector educativo. En Colombia, la participación de los colombianos en los museos es bajísima, es tan solo del 11%. Cuando se le pregunta a la gente por qué decidió no asistir a un museo en un año, las razones principales son la falta de interés y la falta de tiempo. No son la plata, no son el precio de la entrada al museo. Y definitivamente el interés se cultiva. Y por eso me refiero a la necesidad de trabajar mucho más en sintonía con el sector educativo, cómo poder cultivar desde más pequeños en la gente el hábito de estar más cerca de los museos y del arte, porque sin duda la posibilidad de ver el mundo a través de los ojos de los artistas hará personas más sensibles, más creativas, más críticas y personas pues también mejor informadas.
5 years ago, when I had recently been appointed director of Tate Modern, I would have gladly joined this conference and spoken really confidently about my vision for the museum. Tate Modern was still in its teenage years. It had been flourishing since birth. It was still on an exponential growth curve of rising visitor figures and income, had a growing international profile. We were a leading light in the move to deconstruct the Western canon, and I think we were very successfully dismantling gender imbalances in our collection and programme. I wonder whether I also would have shared with you my rising anxieties about that direction of travel, my sense of unease about the viability of perpetual growth, my frustration with the stranglehold of the blockbuster model, my discomfort with the relentless encroachment of the marketplace, but above all a kind of sense of dislocation from a world that felt profoundly threatened by those intersections of social, racial, climate and ecological crises. In July 2019, at Tate, and prompted by British artists, we declared a climate and ecological emergency. And for me, this really marked the end point of the status quo, which had nurtured that great era of museum building and the expansion of which Tate Modern had been a part. And that was an era of unfettered growth and optimism. So the disruption of COVID and its very significant damage wrought to our museum and to artists and to the sector really as a whole over the last 18 months, I think has demonstrated pretty unequivocally just how the fortunes of our curatorial vision, our strategies, our whole museums are inextricably bound into the fortunes of the wider world and the culture in which we operate. So our future is bound up in how we negotiate our passage through troubled times. Fortunately, perhaps Tate Modern has always had to see itself as part of the wider culture. We were the third child of Tate Galleries, and Tate itself a national museum founded at the end of the 19th century. And much of that 19th century evidence is still in our systems and structures. But Tate had two collections, a National Collection of British Art from 1500 and the National Collection of Modern Foreign Art from 1900. And it has always had to negotiate its way through a very complex matrix structure. 5 museum directors, 4 locations sharing one division, one vision and one collection. So room for chaos for sure, but also space and potential for a complex ecology of interdependence and nourishment, and sometimes comfort in troubled times. Tate Modern was born at a time also when the canons of the humanities were under assault from every direction, from the universities and art history, from feminism, from artists of colour, and so on. And starting anew for Tate meant start with negotiation. We set out provisionally, as much as purposefully, and our brand tag, I think, was at that stage about opening up art, creating a public space for conversation and debate. And therefore, the introduction of a thematic hang without chronology right from the start, and despite the fact that it was almost universally condemned, enabled Tate both to set aside many of the kind of constrictions of art history, but much more importantly, put a framework in place that meant that we could both endlessly experiment with our programmes and more significantly begin to build a collection beyond that canon of geography and media, guided less by a belief in a scripted art history and more a commitment to reflect the diversity of the UK demographic, the need to trace the transnational conversation in art that transcends national boundaries, and the multimedia histories of today's practices, and open up that conversation to other voices. And the continuation of that legacy is incredibly important as we move forward. And despite those anxieties and concerns that I shared with you, it is that sense of adaptability, of contingency, and indeed, to quote Stuart Hall, of the museum at any moment in time just being a temporary stabilisation that feels to me the most important provision in our thinking going forward about how to reshape the museum. And as we pick up the pieces of the museum post-COVID, there is an opportunity to reset and to rethink the model. And in light of those concerns that were evident even beforehand, we need to put the intersection of planet and people first. So we need to reduce our carbon emissions. We need to think about and reduce our value chain emissions. We need to reshape our business model, our systems and our structures. We need to become climate activists. We need absolutely to recognise the intersection of climate and other injustices. Climate impacts will undoubtedly deepen the divide between the privileged and underprivileged. For a public institution in public ownership, not to act is no longer an option. So while we need to acknowledge responsibility for our national past and move on to think creatively about the future, we need also to adapt. Like the world's half the world's population took radical uncertainty as the norm. We need to think outside the box of the art world and accept the fact that trust and public affection are not givens, that relevance is not inevitable, and we need to work in everything we do, not just for our public, but with our public. We need to recognise, reciprocate, respect the multiple stakeholders who constitute the museum community, and ultimately understand that the museum community is nothing if it is not part of the community, local, national, and international. So how does this re-envisaging play out curatorially? Well, I would imagine less exhibitions, longer runs, fewer international loans, and that's what we're working towards, and different exhibitions. We really think about content, rich content, with storytelling to the fore. We're rewilding the landscape around our building, but we're also rewilding modernism and notions of fine art, cancelling the exclusionary practices of the past. As for our collection, fewer acquisitions surely, but more transformative and more on view, and maybe on view differently, and maybe elsewhere beyond our walls. Ours is a publicly owned resource, but we need to think about what that actually means, aside from the fact that it's freely on view. How can we activate that public ownership? Curatorial strategy won't do that alone. We need to nurture a community of practice that bypasses the entirely archaic divisions and hierarchies between silos, between front and back of house, between the disciplines of learning and curatorial, between social practice and academic research. At Tate, we've already dismantled divisions between nation states and media specialisms in our collecting, and I think we feel confident in doing this. We know the benefits of hybrid collaborative working. We should feel confident, we should feel empowered, and it is beginning. If you visited Tate Modern right now this summer, you would find hundreds of children drawing maniacally all over the floor of the turbine hall, banners hanging from the ceiling, and drawings spilling out into the landscape. It's called Mega Please Draw Freely, in a project inspired by the Japanese Gutai group of the 1950s. Their work is on display in our galleries. The project is led by artist A. Arakawa and advised by Gutai specialist Professor Ming Tiampo and our Research Centre for Transnational Studies. It's curated by learning and curatorial colleagues working together in collaboration with our visitor team. This kind of project would have been inconceivable 2 years ago, but it will become, I hope, a model of best practice in coming months and years. Let's think of the museum as jointly and severally sites of learning and play, of creativity and renewal, of adaptability and resilience, essential contributors to a viable future for us all.
Thank you very much for having me on this occasion. I want to devote my time to talking about the collection and how much during this past decade at MoMA our collective efforts really centered on thinking about how and why the collection of the museum is what defines our identity, is completely the reason for MoMA having its position in the world that it has. And yet over the preceding number of decades, for us, like so many other museums around the world, it felt like the collection suffered in terms of the attention given instead to temporary exhibitions, the shows that would be on the marquee. So we made the commitment, this is going back some 10 years, that we were going to rethink from square one how the collection, galleries at MoMA, could be re-envisioned. And I think the first thing that we established, which was gigantic, was that we could no longer separate the collection galleries into the mediums that our departments represent. So at MoMA, since always, the mediums of painting and sculpture, or drawings and prints, or film, or architecture and design, photography, have been what governed the administering of the work, the departments, the staffs, but also their presentations in public. So you would go over here for drawings, over there for photos, etc., with, of course, the vast majority of the real estate going to painting and sculpture. And I think that what we all believe deeply was that mirroring the administrative divisions in the presentation of the work made no sense. The only reason it made sense is that each curator of their respective department was able to operate like an autocrat and did not have to consult with others, collaborate with others in terms of the way that their galleries were set up. But we felt it was untrue to artists. Artists don't only work in one medium. We felt it was untrue to collectors. Collectors don't show drawings in the bedroom and paintings in the living room and design objects in the study. Of course, you live with everything, like artists make everything, and the separation of them into these zones in the museum was an artificialization and an institutionalization, and in a way made them less art true and instead more bureaucracy true. So we knew we had to figure out a way for all of the departments to stop operating as islands and to work together to install every gallery with at least a couple of different, if not all of the different departments represented. So that was literally a decade worth of reshaping every aspect of how we behaved, how we thought, who we talked with. And all I can say is that whereas things got way more complicated and way more difficult, none of us would ever consider going back to the way it used to be. You know, and I hope I can say that it's apparent in the galleries, the electricity among works of art and the way we're able to present a given subject or a given time period, a given place. The mutual synergy among these works in different mediums, different fields, it's absolutely indispensable to doing what we were wanting to do. I think it's undeniably richer, and it goes back to the roots of what MoMA was trying to do when we were founded in 1929, which was not be a museum for painting or sculpture or drawings, but one that invented the idea that photography, that film, that architecture could be part of what a museum did. So why separate out those things? Why not let them have the back and forth that the museum's original vision had set out for them? So in a way, what we thought we were doing over this last decade was not inventing something, but actually returning to our roots in a very positive way. Besides merging the disciplines in our presentation of the collection, the other thing that was really important to us was that it not be fixed, that it rotate over time at a pretty regular and quick pace. One reason for that was practical, that there was absolutely no excuse for having 90 or 95% of our storage, of our collection in storage. The only way to correct that or to work against that, other than building a museum that was 100 stories tall with galleries, you know, beyond one that one could even count, would be to face the problem, in a sense, face the space problem with a time solution, and saying that the galleries would be installed one way for a certain amount of time, and then after that many months be installed another way and another way. And that was at least what we could do to confront this issue of the great majority of things being in storage the great majority of the time, to shake that up to the degree that we could. But the corollary to that, which was very, very important, symbolically as well as literally, was that it took away this idea of the collection as a fixed art historical canonical doctrine, or even of the idea of one art history. And instead, this implicit message from us as our collection galleries rotate is there is no one history, there is no one perspective, there is no true as opposed to a false, there is no most important and everything else, there's no one question. What we're showing you with these galleries that are in a state of flux is that any single work of art, any single artist, any single group of artworks or artists can be thought of in infinite numbers of ways, depending on what questions are being asked and who's asking those questions. So that will bring me to my third point about how we dealt with the collections. We felt it was very important to broaden the number of people who are working on them. For many, many years, the chief curator of each department would be in charge of the way their galleries were installed, and maybe they'd have an assistant or two. But it was very much one person's vision in these respective fields, or a few people, but each at once. So a very auteur kind of concept of the curator. The galleries, as we are now carrying them out, any single gallery is the product of 2 or 3 different voices in collaboration. And any given floor is, say, 20 galleries, is the product of, you know, anywhere between a dozen and a couple dozen people in conversation from different backgrounds, from different fields, different generations. And I think that is palpable now. When you go through our galleries, you feel the conversations among the curators the same way, or through the conversations among the works of art. That there's an energy in those presentations that comes from the challenging and the dialogue that went into setting up those galleries. And that's what we want our visitors to do. We don't want our visitors to come and say, ooh, that's beautiful, that's impressive. We want to get their brains going, as well as their feelings and their even physical reactions. And it makes it a very inspiring time to be a worker at MoMA, I feel. I feel like we're taking the museum from a place that maybe would be associated in people's minds with a place that was always in the position of saying no. You know, no, this museum, no, this art isn't great enough. No, this artist isn't important enough. This artist isn't white enough. This artist isn't male enough. Now we're turning the tables and saying, yes, we have the authority that we do. We have the power that we do. Of course, we're not denying that. But we're using that to say yes, to be the place that says, yes, we are open to all of these parts of artists' art making that is making the world in which we're working so much bigger and so much more interesting.
A warm welcome from the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. You see a tiny bit of the historical building behind me. Built in 1895, 126 years ago, the Stedelijk Museum started as a private foundation, founded by private people, brought together in terms of finances by private people. And we just did some research to this foundation. And we found out, most of the Dutch museums and a lot of cultural institutions in the Netherlands were financed for a great deal also by funding, by money which came from the colonialist trade. The 19th century was very wealthy in terms of colonial finances, and we are no exception on other museums, maybe even a bit more. We are built on colonialist trade, and this is something we are very aware of and something we will publish about also in the near future. It soon became a city museum. It became the museum of the city of Amsterdam. First of all, with very different and very completely old-fashioned kind of collections brought together. But the museum turned into a museum of modern and contemporary art just before the Second World War. When Willem Sandberg was a curator here, he was a director after the Second World War, and he was the one who turned this museum also in terms of its collection to a museum for modern and contemporary art and design as it is now. The museum collections are, I would say, very Western. They are very Western European based, very Northern American based, like most museums. They are very male, they are very white, and they don't show that much diversity. We have a great collection, we have great collections. We have a wonderful collection of modernist painting, international style, everything is there. We have a very important collection of post-war painting, starting with Cobra, which comes from the northern West European situation, of course. We have large collections of color field painting, abstract expressionism, later also Italian Transavantgardia, German painting from the 1980s, etc., etc. We have, apart from that, also important collections in terms of minimal art, conceptual art, and very specific, more than a lot of other museums, probably time-based media. We have from Nam June Paik until Joan Jonas, until Ed Atkins, Steve McQueen, and on the other side also like Abramovich and Ulay or Tino Segal in our collections. A lot of video installations, a lot of video works, a lot of performances also having been collected just recently. We were donated also a performance by Nora Turato, for instance. Special highlight in the collection is a huge collection, a large collection, the largest outside of Russia, of Kazimir Malevich works. And this is a bit of an exception to the normally very Western situation here in our holdings. The last years, of course, like everybody, also the Stedelijk found out that we have to diverse, that we have to broaden. And we are in the complete process of broadening. And this is something, in terms of inclusion, which we try and do on all different levels. We try and look at our staff. And we made important steps specifically also in the artistic staff to be able to work with people from other regions also. We found 2 curators at large who give us advice and give us the possibility of thinking a bit more global about the collection. Also, we found some new curators with different backgrounds who were able to share new thoughts of globalization with us, who are able to share the possibilities of decolonializing a collection like ours. And for instance, last year, or even the end of the year before, we already proclaimed as a Stedelijk Museum that for the next 4 years we will invest at least 50% of our acquisition budget for works which have been produced by artists of color or by artists with a background which is not specifically Western European or Northern American. So we set ourselves some goals. And we also are working on new collection displays in which we are showing the difference. We try and focus much more on female artists. We try and focus a lot more on artists from color. And we find in the collection also examples of this, which were, for instance, brought also by Willem Sandberg in the years when he was also, let's say, broadening his mind and his view on different regions in the world, also parallel to the ideas of Cobra and other artists who were just thinking at that period still of the ideas of direct expressionism, primitivism in between brackets, as we also mentioned every now and then in that respect, and which we would not do anymore today. So we are broadening the collection. We are trying to tell different stories, different narratives in the collection displays. We came up with a new thematic approach to the collection display. We want to be storytelling because we have the feeling that in a new world with different demographic structures, we have to find new ways of reaching people, of reaching audiences, of reaching visitors who are completely diverse. And we need to do this to give everybody the idea that he or she can also be represented in the museum collection and also in the way we are telling those stories. We want to be on a societal level much more relevant. It's about social relevance. We want to tell stories which have to do with the world around us. And we have to tell stories also when we are setting up a collection display of a bit more historical situation. We also have to try and tell stories which can be also explained from today. In our exhibition program, just to give you an example, we just opened up a show on Kirchner and Nolde, German expressionist artists who are very much also working in the colonialist tradition in terms of instrumentalization, in terms of using people from color, black models for their ethnographic materials, material culture as we always called it, and which is something which we probably have to think about different also now, which they used in their artistic expression. It's a critical view on the work of those great artists. And what we are trying to do is, for instance, put much more focus on the persons who were depicted, on the models who were depicted, and trying to find a much more human story behind everything. It's about humanity, it's about being more human in the future, and it's about looking at our modernist collection with the eyes of today, with the knowledge of today, because an exhibition like that on Kirchner and Nolde would not have been possible 20 years ago. And it's also necessary to embed the contemporary in that was present here in the more modernist collection displays. So we are looking to make bridges. We're looking for social relevance. And we can find this social relevance only by broadening our scope, by broadening our collections, by broadening the methods by which we are working together, by broadening our staff, by broadening ourselves. We believe in globalization in terms of diversity, in terms of thinking from very different perspectives and angles and trying to build bridges between all those different angles. That's what we are up to here at Stedelijk. That's what all of us most probably are up to right now. And I think it's the big assignment for all of us to work on the next years. Broadening up, getting more social relevant, remaining flexible, being proactive and also reactive in terms that we are able to react on what happens, because today we do not know what is going to be happening tomorrow. And it's important to realize. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we're live. So, hello, my name's Jennifer Higgy. I'm a writer, Australian writer living in London, although I'm in Greece at the moment. And thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this discussion tonight. And happy 60th birthday to the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen. It's a great anniversary. And thank you also very much to Vivian Trommer for her marvelous organization of this discussion. And also it was extraordinary watching just now the statements by the various museum directors, really fascinating. And I look forward to revisiting them. I'm honored to chair this evening's very timely discussion. How can modern and contemporary art museums meet the challenges of our time? And a huge question, and we'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions. So feel free to post them into the chat. Without any further ado, please meet our wonderful panelists tonight, all of whom work with art in different locations and in different forms, from creating it to curating it and running museums for the display of a wide cross-section of art forms. In New Delhi this evening, we have Jibesh Bagchi from the Raqs Media Collective. And Raqs was formed in 1992. Its self-declared imperative of kinetic contemplation produces, in their words, a trajectory that is restless in its forms and exacting in its procedures. So it'll be very interesting digging down into that and how that impacts on the idea of what a museum might be in this day and age. Then, of course, hardly needing any introduction is Susanne Gaensheimer, the art historian, curator, and, of course, director of the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen. And very happy to meet you again tonight, Susanne. We have Omar Khalif, who's a writer, curator, cultural historian, and director of collections and senior curator at the Sharjah Art Foundation. And then, due to unforeseen circumstances, I'm afraid Koyu was unable to attend tonight. But we're very honored to host a colleague, Storm Jans van Rensburg, who is the senior curator and head of curatorial affairs at Zuidsmoker in Cape Town. So welcome to all of these panelists in various parts of the world. I must say this has been one of the good things about Zoom, that we've all learned how to do this. We could never have done this, I don't think, 2 years ago. So it's great to be with you all. So I'd like to just jump in with a deceptively straightforward question. And that is, generally speaking, in terms of museums, what do you feel needs to change and what needs to stay the same? Perhaps, Susanne, as it's your birthday, you can be the first respondent. What are your thoughts on this enormous question?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all, Jibesh, Omar, and Storm, to be here with us tonight. I'm looking very much forward to speaking with you the next 45 minutes. And that question, of course, is very large, and we are dealing with it since years, and we heard so many statements of very interesting colleagues from other museums in the world. So I think the main challenge for all of us is really to develop a consciousness of what are the challenges of the time right now, and not only generally, but also in our very specific urban surroundings. Every city is different, every public is different. So we really need to kind of balance a general, like a awareness of a general situation in the world, and then a very specific one relating to our direct immediate communities. And realizing how our public has changed, who is our audience today, and how do we have to change our way of speaking to this diverse audience. And I think like in Düsseldorf, like one of the really large issues we have to change is the collection itself. As Anne Temkin just said, the collection is kind of the source of our identity. And for me, this is the place where we have to start. And in the case of Düsseldorf, we have a really very, very canonical, very closed, although like really great collection, but we have to find a way to open that up. This means strategically, intentionally focusing on integrating more female artists, on integrating more positions from non-Western countries, to make the whole constellation much more diverse, much more opening up to the multifaceted public we have today. And this, the same thing, of course, this same approach relates also to our other programs, to the exhibitions, to the programs. But I think another issue which we all are facing at the moment is how can we change our inner structures within the museum? Like, for example, how can we more and more become sustainable? How can we more and more, like Francis Morris said, how can we become climate activists? This is not so easy to do. There are many questions involved and many impossibilities and so on. And one thing which I very much believe in, and because the question is also what should stay and what is good. And there's one thing I really think we should believe in and continue to believe in, which is that we are public institutions. I mean, not all of us, but like Düsseldorf is a public institution. What means public? To whom belongs our collection? How can we make our space open for whom? And how can we really take the idea of publicness? How can we take it serious? And how can we deal with it in a responsible way? So that's something I think we can also continue more thinking about what means public today.
Absolutely. And I think that it's very interesting thinking about your role as a museum that has been around for 6 decades, and say museums such as your museum, Storm, in Cape Town, which is about to turn 4. So it's a very new museum in a very different context, and dealing obviously not just with the European art, but the art of the African continent as well. So how is it that, what is your response to this question about what needs to stay the same and what needs to change in terms of museums from your context?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Susanne, also for those considerations. And I think certainly echoes a lot of our thinking. But I also want to move this conversation into away also from abstract spaces of thinking and contemplation, but also kind of this certain reckoning that I think has happened, I think, across museums and experiences, since the start of the pandemic. It's a reckoning about our purpose, our kind of impact, our communities, our role, a big question about kind of just relevance as well. And I think we have, of course, we play very important roles in that, but I also want to move us into spaces of doing. And I think if there's one thing for us as a nascent institution, is that we're in the process of making a museum, and a process of making a museum as critical practice. And so for us, it's also about doing, and to be nimble and to be responsive and to be able to move fast. Of course, we don't have, if I can call it, the burden of a longer history. It does mean that we can also be inventive and experimental. And so that's a chance that we're taking as well. But I also briefly want to talk about our specific context, and not only necessarily of South Africa and Cape Town, but also of the continent. Then if I may paraphrase Koyo Kuo, who often says that in our context, we are used to work in states of crisis. So it does mean that it's not necessarily the right way to operate and be. But these modes of crisis has also kind of like schooled us into a particular way of being and thinking, also in terms of our institution making. So these are kind of broadly, I think, what I think we want to kind of hook some of our kind of like actions onto. But then also to think about the museum as almost three-pronged, a place of knowledge and learning, a space of doing and making, but ultimately also as a space for learning as well.
So would you say that what you take from the past in terms of the positives would be the idea of curating in terms of being a caring activity, like something that cares for objects, cares for ideas, and moves them forward?
Absolutely. And I think what needs to stay, and what I know, kind of at the beginning of, being closed for such a long period of time and sporadically being closed, is that what we do value I think is essential about the work of museums is that there's an engagement with public, as you say, Susanne, but it's also a particular engagement with objects in a particular environment and space. And I think there's something that we cannot take that I think remains for us. It's a space to be in as a public, as a person, and to have that engagement in that environment. And that's a kind of, I don't want to call it a communing with objects, but I think that is something that very much for us stays. And what the pandemic has taught us as well, though, is like how we communicate with our audiences and how we reach them. And I kind of think we're all on a big learning curve at this particular moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at the discussion we're having now, across the world. We wouldn't have had that a couple of years ago. So there are some positives we can take away. But Jibesh, I'm very interested to hear your perspective on this as an artist, as a collective, as a group that has not only created objects, but has also created situations and exhibitions and have worked in a sense as activists as well. I mean, if we can see the museum right now as an institution that is in a state of flux, that is being rewritten, how would you like to see it change?
Thanks for staging this question. One of the most important part of our, coming from our own experience of having worked as artists and also curatorially, but mostly through the Biennale context, which completely changes the museum. It puts a different kind of pressure on the museum. But from the curator, as an artist, we have engaged primarily, what you understand is that the museum produces a problematic for itself when it invites an artist. It is part of a larger problematic. And there is a sense of a totality by which it is working, a certain kind of, you can say, provisional totalities that they work on, what is the nature of the collection, or who they are catering to, and what is the world that they are shaping. So this too, the problematic and the totality is what constitute the paradigm in which you start engaging. So most of the time, our work with museum, and we have been very lucky, we work with curators and museum directors who have engaged, who didn't have the idea of endorsement, but engagement. So exhibitions as an engagement, not an endorsement. And the second is that the relationship has not been ethnographic, but generative. This is a very important part, because coming from the various different sites of the world, one realizes that the form of engagement could be ethnographic, but that means you are kind of you have to give a sense of where you're coming from. But there could be another form of engagement which is generative, that you produce a different idea of a place, different imaginations, and so I think the contemporary tension of museum, the intellectual labor that goes into making of museums, the director, the curator, everyone, deals with this tension, the framing of the problematic, the questions of totalities that they are provisionally positioning themselves in, and the tensions between the ethnographic, the generative, and that's the kind of intense pressure. And if you say today, and you can see and it will emerge everywhere, we have three pressure points, broadly we can sense, is this the climate, the question of the climate, which is everywhere there is a pressure. The climate change changes the terms of how we relate to each other completely. The leaf falling here in one place has a dynamics, we know that. And then the next one is this shift to the decolonial from anti-colonial, post-colonial too, which is another completely different kind of pressure, which is kind of makes the pressure simultaneous. So earlier, the anti-colonial, you could have MoMA doing its whole collection and the big anti-colonial movement shaping the world, but there would be no dialogue. There was no dialogue, So it could be a lag. An elite can practice lags. There was no problem, but now it can't. So this is a very, very radical shift. Even the post-colonial, about 20, 25 years of lags are acceptable within the from late 70s to early part of 2000. But now there is no lag. So the pressures are simultaneous in all sides. And then third, the digital, you keep on this moment, this contemporary moment, the digital no longer is tertiary. no longer you can add. So what is done is that, so we kind of say that now the museum problematic is very different. And the totality that provisionally will be constructed by each and every one of the museum, the intellectual labor that will go into making of these museums discursively will be provisional, will be sharp shifting, and will be compressed by this kind of trans-global movement. Every point is to be asked the question how they're doing it. There is no, in that sense, a local movement anymore.
So are you feeling, very generally speaking, more positive now, say, about the role of museums and your role as an artist within museums than you were, say, when you started out as a collective? Do you feel that these discussions have really radically changed over the last 30 years?
It has become more porous. I won't say that it is more porous. There is more listening going around here, and the more scrutiny of museum practice. I think the last few years, one thing is marked is the scrutiny of the museum practice. And also, like, we are working in Vienna now in the Academy of Fine Arts. The collection is one of the oldest among art schools in the whole world. And the kind of generous way in which the whole administration and the collection curators and the full faculty opened the collection for scrutiny, for discussion, for even playful displacement. This is something that is happening with this present conceptual pressure in the world. And I think that is a very generative time for museums, generative times for artists, curators. It's a colliding time. It's not going to be easy. It is going to open up, and every opening up has also various kind of dust and hues, but it is opening up the confidence. So let's say there is more confidence in the air.
I will move on to talk about the role of collections, which I think is a really potent discussion to be had. But before we do that, Omar, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you are the curator of artistic director of a biennale that happens in the United Arab Emirates. And how do these discussions around museums and the role of museums impact on your practice?
Well, I should clarify that I was only the curator of the Biennale for one edition with two others, but I'm a director of the foundation, Sharjah Art Foundation, which houses within it the Biennale amongst numerous other organs. The conversation around publicness here is very interesting because the organization that I work for in the UAE is a public organization, a government-funded and run organization, but I also live between the UK and the UAE, and my career has been developed in various contexts, including the US, Africa, and West Asia, as well as the UK. And the notion of publicness in its very self, I think, needs to be interrogated, because when I think about publicness, I'm actually thinking about the way that we engage the public. Now, one of the biggest issues that the pandemic made very visible to me as a curator, as a director of a series of spaces, was that there is this expectation from certain publics that even after the pandemic, even after the economic collapse that followed that museums would still be able to put on these kinds of blockbuster shows that cost potentially millions of pounds to stage without a sense of awareness of the changing times. And I think we've created, as institutions, a kind of mega commoditization of the field, whereby institutions continue to physically grow and continue to look a certain way. And one of the things that I would like to see change, and something that I would say very much I learned from Sharjah, is the Sharjah Art Foundation is an organization that basically uses the existing infrastructure primarily of heritage buildings, many of which are under threat. So in our current portfolio, we have around 30 buildings. And what we do is we invite artists, architects, designers, and thinkers to use those spaces so that we can generate interest to be able to re-embody those spaces, those histories, and restore them. But what's particularly unique is that they spread across a huge expanse from one gulf literally to another. And that idea of the institution being dispersed, I think, is a very interesting idea in terms of thinking about how museums can change, because we cannot continue to assume that publics can come because there are numerous things from socioeconomic status, mobility, and so forth, but also the idea of having these plazas with all the museums in one place. Does anyone really want to see 6 museums in one day? Or do we want to also tailor to those specific subsets and communities? So I think it's one of the things that really has to change is how we think of the notion of public, and to actually stop using this idea of community outreach to, as if it's, we're doing something quite wonderful by reaching local communities. No, that should be the imperative, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. In terms of your museum, I mean, again, a very broad question, but who does it serve? And I think this is, Omar's brought up this very interesting question about who is the public and what is the responsibility of the museum to the public. When you have, a very rich 60-year-old historic collection, of course, you've got many of the modern masters. The museums were founded with a collection of Paul Klee, I think. So how do you achieve a balance between, say, satisfying a desire possibly for seeing historic exhibitions and also serving perhaps debates around what museums should be doing? And so who is your audience, and what is it that you think that how you should best serve them? Sorry, that was a bit confused, but...
whom did you ask, Jennifer?
This is for you, Susanne. Okay. Yeah, for your museum.
I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of your historic collection and the contemporary moment, who does the museum serve?
What we do here in Düsseldorf is that we try to differentiate our program in that way that we have different narratives and different programs and different contents for different audiences. Like, for example, a younger audience which is interested in political issues. But then we have also our classical audience, which really loves the collection and wants to see modernist artist exhibitions. So we try really on a broad scale to offer many different perspectives on art and what we do. But in the whole, we do try to change the narrative as a whole. So how can we integrate issues which are of relevance to all of us, like, for example, climate change or political issues or issues of gender, of democracy, of diversity? How can we integrate these issues basically in all our programs so that as a whole we kind of change the narrative, and also we can become a place of debate, actually. That's what we more and more want to become, a place of debate, not only of looking, but of debating. And of course, the audience changes because through that, what we are doing right now, our audience became much broader. And now all of a sudden, we don't have only the regional audience and international guests, tourists, but we, on a daily basis, can communicate internationally on this level, like we do it right now. And that, of course, changes also the expectation to what we send out.
I think that one of the most exciting things around art history at the moment is this idea that the art history that many of us were taught, including me at art school in Australia, was an extremely skewed and biased one. The idea that it was, white men writing about other white men, basically. And now the idea that, art history is a work in progress. It's a history of inclusion, of people of color, of different genders, of different class structures. And I think that it's a very exciting challenge now for museums to, I love the term actually that Frances Morris from Tate Modern used. She talked about not only rewilding the area around Tate Modern, but she talked about rewilding modernism. And I think that that's a very sort of rich metaphor given our climate emergency and also our emergency of self self-representation too, in terms of how art history is written. And so, Storm, how does your museum rise to these challenges in Cape Town? Who is your audience, in a sense, and how do you serve them?
It's a complex question because we're in a complex environment, kind of just from the city of Cape Town itself, which, kind of have so much, kind of the vestiges of apartheid still very palpable around us, and the kind of stratifications that come with that. And so we're navigating that past very kind of carefully and in a considered manner as well, and understanding that, kind of this context require kind of special measures as well. And so there are many aspects and ways that we kind of address that. But I also want to say that, kind of we, as an institution, whilst we're based in Cape Town, we often say we're not a Cape Town institution, meaning we are an institution of the African continent and its diaspora, and that is our representation. And that we're an institution with an international outlook. So whilst we're also dealing with a kind of local context very specifically in various ways, and I can give you some examples of that as well, we are tuned in to connected what's happening with sister institutions globally. And so that is, I think, the moment that I think we all need to kind of be almost in tune with. And it comes also with certain responsibilities. But in terms of the ways that we respond, when the museum reopened in October last year, after 8 months of being closed, Koyo came up with this idea that we're going to invite every Cape Townian to bring an artwork to the museum to be installed. And we did that. And so in a month's process of collecting or asking the public of Cape Town to bring work, knowing that the kind of audiences has not been able to be the museum, or that we don't have international visitors, or we had 1,700 people rocking up to the museum to bring their artworks, and we installed every single one of them. And that's one way, and not the only way, and it's not the solution necessarily to kind of systemic issues in our society. But this is a moment where I also think that the kind of like barriers that might have existed in the past, we have to really completely rethink. And so this, what I called Koyo's crazy idea, became really kind of a beacon in the city at this particular moment. And also kind of, I think, every time we've engaged with those exhibitors, the kind of understanding that art plays a real impact on people's lives, lived lives, outside of this kind of like rarefied environment of contemporary art and its markets. So I think that's one example of how that happens. Of course, we have a very strong Center for Art Education that does incredible work across communities. We are rethinking also how we bring practice into the museum through an atelier project. Making happens on site, engage with audiences at the same time. So these are the kind of ways that we also kind of like unpick some of that. But Omar, I really appreciate also your kind of suggestion also of the decentralization of the museum. And to kind of like really, I think it's a very valuable kind of prompt as well for us. But we also kind of invested in very specific architecture, and that is also what we've inherited. But I also want to come back very briefly also about, not to challenge you, but also to say that I still believe that exhibition making is a really valuable part of what we do. And so exhibition making, storytelling. The question is what kind of exhibitions are we making, and what kind of investments are made, and the blockbuster as a thing, let's totally revisit it. But I don't want us to not think about making exhibitions, and that language is that is so special.
I think that absolutely. I think that's such a valid point around the idea. In a sense, what you're really talking about is criteria, in a way. If we've been challenging the Western art historical canon, I think that what comes into that is that museums are now reassessing the idea of value, not just the value of a blockbuster or a rich painting, but the value of communication and the power of art to communicate to very many different parts of society. And I think that this idea of value is a really important one, because it challenges the sort of innate genius idea of that, many museums have, were founded on, in a sense. And so, Jabesh, I'd be very interested to hear what how you as a collective have dealt with this idea of criteria or value in terms of assessing what is worth representing, what is worth exhibiting, and what is worth promoting as an idea within a museum.
See, when there are two aspects to it. One is that one is doing a kind of a quasi-curatorial or a performative work in the museum context. And sometimes you are yourself being curated and showing a work in a museum. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that you understand is that the criteria is a kind of, it is not a settled fixed entity called criteria or a value. It is a discursively being produced in the contact of the museum, the intellectual labor that is going on in the museum, because it's not inert. It's not an inert mass. It's a extremely dynamic intellectual labor that is on. When we were showing in K21, there is a lot of, you realize that there's a lot of internal dialogue that is already happened for you to be made sense of, and the travel and the distance has already been at one level been worked on before that transformation of the act of showing is happening. Mm-hmm. So to understand that, and then that discursively you have to produce what I think I will introduce, not criteria and value, I will with forms of intelligibility and what you leave as unintelligible. In a sense that one as artists, when you're working with forms of intelligibility. And then you do want to leave certain, not to be read ethnographically or not to become determined as being told ethnographically. You leave certain thing unintelligible for yourself as much as for the conversation or for the discursive milieu that you're part of. So, and this is something that is very dynamically and is very immaterial and intangible and continuously being formed. And formed not only during the exhibition, but formed after and wrong relay of the exhibition in the way you practice, you think your practice. But I will take another thing that in a museum context where we have worked, where there's a biennale happening, it's completely different, because biennale doesn't work through the logic of assets. In a sense that artwork is not an asset in a biennale. Museum has an idea of asset in a broad sense. In a broad sense, they do a lot of commissioning. They do have value to the commissioning, but it's not worked yet to the logic of asset. So it does have a very different relationship to the same structure. So I worked in Yokohama in a museum, which is a hard modernist museum, where you can't really do much changing, like in the collection. But when you are doing a biennale, you can do anything with that structure. You can hide the structure completely. We completely vanish the facade. So that's the interesting thing, is that in the present moment, we have the different ideas of assets and different ideas of values and different ideas of production connected with it. And I think what is intelligent about museum, the labor that is going on in museums now, in my conversation, in our understanding and reading and whatever glances we get, is that this conversation has become very active now. And I'm not talking about the immovable asset. I'm not talking about the weights of that 19th century, mid 20th century. I'm not talking about that at all, because that is beyond my remit. I think that's a different kind of insurance logic, which in the Vienna exhibition we are trying to gesture, trying to evoke, and trying to bring out. But I'm talking about those temporary forms, those kind of intangible works, those kind of interactive forms that are emerging in the last 15, 20 years. Those have not been settled as assets. Those have not been settled as forms that can be easily transmitted. And we are talking here about a very large group of artists all over the world, continuously moving and producing artwork. Yeah. And that is I think that's the turbulence of the present. And that's, I think museums, that's the museum's work now, will be how to engage with the turbulence.
This idea of intelligibility and, of course, brings up ideas of local versus global as well, because what is unintelligible to one person might be intelligible to someone else, depending on, the cultural mores they've been brought up with and the visual forms that they're accustomed to. And so, Omar, perhaps you can respond to this idea, this very interesting point that Jibesh has brought up.
Well, yeah, I was thinking that what I wanted to do was actually respond to that, because just every time I speak, I realize that there's a huge kind of misunderstanding about what it is that we are. But essentially, we were, a leading biennial that from which a foundation grew that now incorporates the entire artistic contemporary infrastructure to a degree as an umbrella organization. And one of the things that I do as the director of collections and senior curator is to oversee the acquisition of works from the biennial. So the collection itself, which has over 1,300 works, which are primarily installation, as well as many archival materials and other things, began by trying to acquire those kind of interstitial moments, those happenings, and trying to have a marker. And actually, it's very much that desire to collect that history that led in many respects to the consolidation of the organization from the biennial itself. Because in the Middle East and South Asia, from when the biennial began in the early 90s, there was nothing like it. And still, there are very few things akin to it. So for me, the idea of there's something about this which has to do with not just value and archive, but also with storytelling. So that became one of the things that we do is we try and go back in time. People come with memories of certain performances or installations, and we document that and research that and try and reconstruct or work with the artists to bring that in. But also then we, as a public institution, realized this is, for Sharjah, the main public modern and contemporary art collection. So we began to grow that by thinking of central nodes of research that came through and from these activities, these events. And I would say that, for example, the work of Okwuenueze's post-colonial constellation in 2008 and the beginnings of third text would form a kind of art historical trajectory or lens for us to begin. And from that, we start to schematize a kind of history that is situated, because even though you may have a collection that is in a specific place, and our audience is primarily, about 70% are people of South Asian origin who come to see our exhibitions, 20% Emiratis and 10% tourists. A lot of people still locally collect global Western international art. So the idea is that we have to create roadmaps that allow for languages of inclusion to be theorized and femitized, because we don't have that history. We don't have those books in Arabic for anyone to read.
Yeah. I think that one of the very interesting points you bring up is the idea of storytelling and consensus. And I'm very curious about how, Susanne, this is a question for you, about when museums have really extraordinary historic collections. And when we're at this historic moment now, when we're talking about decoloniality and inclusion and a sort of greater fairness about ideas of representation, how then do you reconcile that with, say, exhibiting artists who are, rightly considered brilliant creative minds, but whose politics don't chime with perhaps the ideas that we might like to promote today? For example, Gauguin, someone like that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and challenging question. Generally speaking, for this country, it is the case that as a state's museum, we have to kind of represent the state's neutrality and should not take on a very particular political attitude or position. Yeah. But on the other hand, we do have opinions and we do have positions, and every figure working in this museum has a different one. Maybe some have the same and others are different. So this question belongs to this whole process of becoming more aware who one is, who is the institution and who is speaking. And the way through which we are speaking, I think, is the art and are the exhibitions and the storytelling we do through the artwork and the exhibitions. So, of course, we can decide which artists we are showing and which artists we are showing not. And then maybe one artist has opinion or an attitude we find critical, but it could be interesting to learn something from. Yeah, like, for example, if you take Kirchner, or Emil Nolde, where we have a very different perspective today than we had like 10 years only before, or even 20, 50 years before. And that's, of course, something which is important and where we all can learn from. Yeah? So I think it's a very delicate line and very delicate balance between being neutral and being political, and then also talking through the art. And what we show and what we do must not always be exactly what we believe in, but we have to contextualize it and reflect it on an historical level, and then see what we can learn from.
I mean, this comes back to the idea of, some people have posited the idea that a museum or a gallery should be a safe space. But of course, that immediately is problematic because it's safe for whom? And does that mean immediately sort of sanitize the art gallery of any real debate? Because the gallery becomes so worried about offending, someone. There will always be someone who will be offended or who will be triggered. So, Storm, how do you deal with these questions around, problematic histories and how they've been represented and your role in showing them now?
I mean, we don't, of course, have the, kind of those collections or holdings to contend with these kind of particular issues that I think you're referring to. But what I do think is that we have a position at the museum that, that we don't necessarily directly respond to burning topical issues at the particular moment that they're in. But we do take a very critical look and embracing of difficult conversations and topics that's relevant for a period. So we are not, kind of shying away from a conversation about race, for example, But it kind of happens within the context, again, of a conversation about art and its, kind of attendant systems. And it would be often then in a conversation or a forum for conversation. And I think this is the place where I think it's very important that those spaces do exist. And so, I don't know if I answer your question entirely, but I think it's important to kind of be responsive to the issues of our time. And at the same time, I think it's also kind of like how that happens. So how do we create spaces for voices to be heard in a museum space? For example, and this, what I referred to earlier, the stories that we tell with our holdings and what that looks like. Because it is also about a kind of the ability for a visitor to come in with whatever world experience they might have and find something in the space of the museum that they can relate to or that mirrors something of their experience. And I think that's an important and very positive aspect for us about how we think about the museum.
Absolutely. I mean, Jibesh, when you work with museums, I feel that you must, as a group, go in order to stimulate a debate around things, so that the idea of a safe space in a museum would be an anathema to you, I imagine. You would prefer it to be a place of dissent and discussion. And how would you respond to this idea of museums and safe spaces or places of dissent?
See, the idea of the safe spaces is primarily about certain kind of aggressive dispositional behavior of some people of exuding power, and they would, and the opposition to it, that let's have it a little less of them, so you call it safe. But I think the idea was also that it is safe to articulate dissenting voice, but also now the tension is that everything is under kind of a surveillance scrutiny eye. I think that even the social media networks have become also surveilling. So the idea of how to produce dissent, what are the forms of language by which dissent has to be produced, itself is under some kind of big transformation. Like for us, a step into a museum or the collection is to ask ourselves questions about how history is narrated, how even time is conceived in museum. I think one of the biggest battle will be how time is conceived. You know, the very idea of what kind of biographical time and historical time, national times are intertwined. You know, individuals become the national time, and then it's very difficult to extract that individual out of the national time. So those kind of debates and discussions will be happening. But now the question is, we have to do it in public life more and more. So it's kind of safe is now. From what I don't know, but I know that it is now no discussion is now in isolation, or it is or there is enough time. There is Obama, while retiring, had this very interesting thing that Kennedy and the Cuban crisis had 13 days to decide, and now the event happens before like Biden. You can know the event has happened before Biden can respond. So he is called into a press conference after the series of events that has happened has changed Afghanistan's history. So the thing is that now the events are ahead of your decision to produce intelligibility and the decision about the event. So we live in this kind of disjuncted kind of time where so I think museums are also facing this. It's an artist. As artists, I know this is happening continuously, and I'm sure as curators we face it. And museum, I'm sure, is not an enclosed space anymore. It doesn't have that enclosure. It may have it in its idea of autonomy or independence, but I think it's now more entanglement has to be thought in. It is not an enclosed space that we're working. We're working in very complicated entanglements. And what are the platforms in this entanglement that we have to do? Yeah, and that's I think a very, very open generative time now for all of us.
I've just seen that we've got 3 questions have come up. So it might be good. Actually, I think this first question really segues very well from what you've been talking about, Jivesh, in terms of new understandings of time and different forms meshing. So there are no names on these questions, so I'll just say what they are. But how do you integrate VR and AI as sustainable media in your institution? So Omar, would you like to talk about that?
I would say that no one has the answer to that, because most institutions don't have the funding to invest in that at this moment beyond in small bursts of projects.
And Susanne, what is the relationship of your institution to VR and AI?
Actually, at the moment, we are producing a pretty large VR project together with Thomas Saraceno, and it is funded by the government of Nordrhein-Westfalen. So, of course, it needs public or other funding, otherwise it couldn't be realized. It's interesting, and then also it is also part of our digital form of communication. So we during the COVID lockdown, we invented different digital forms of communication and also presentations of our exhibitions, for example. And so on that level, the way how we communicate, how we can reach our audience, these techniques do kind of have an influence or are part of the tools we are using. But what Omar says is totally right. It's extremely expensive. So we are pretty lucky here to have the funding to realize more or less of these projects. But yeah, it's part of our work more and more.
I mean, looking at how museums have responded to the COVID pandemic in the last 18 months, it's been quite extraordinary, the rapid changes that have happened. I mean, even when I was in London, I was reviewing the Sydney Biennial, from the other side of the world, because they had an extraordinary online presence, and and I think that's been quite exciting, even though I'm quite old-fashioned and quite like looking at a painting in a room too, but I've got used to this. Storm, how is your institution responding to VR and AI?
I mean, to VR, not in any way, kind of in a meaningful way at the moment, and kind of honestly also not really can be a priority because of the issues that Omar and Susanne has mentioned. But I also want to say that I think for us, the kind of shift to the digital has been significant. And no, they're not the same, but I do think like we are seriously looking at developing those. And I think our presence online and in the digital realm has been very important for us. And in a way, almost that I think that for that moment and the beginning of the pandemic, where we all had to adjust to that idea that we are museums that don't have buildings, kind of had to fill this kind of space somehow as well, of like rethinking ourselves outside of our kind of the constraints of our architecture and the kind of physicalness of our work. And I think that is definitely kind of a significant shift that has already happened, and that we've, what you say, also adapted to. And that's just been ways of reaching audience and people. But I think in terms of the notion of exhibition making and in digital spaces, it's not necessarily something that we see as a priority. Rightly or wrongly.
Yeah. So the next question, and we've got 9 minutes left, so we've got 2 more questions. So this one is regarding the term publicness. I am curious if you can elaborate on how the role of the curator can change while we are rethinking the museum. Should it change? Maybe Jibesh, that might be a good one for you, because you're an artist and a curator, and
I'm not in an institution. So, but what I think what is interesting now is that curatorial practice is one of those practice which has to think of large aggregates and very, very across different historical lineages and different time horizons. And this is something, I think this is something that yet curatorial practice or thinking about curatorial practice is not articulated. It is in the practice, but it is not articulated and expressed itself. It is still it is still publicly thought in terms of power, selection, inclusion, that kind of older trope of 20th century trope. Curatorial is now going to become more and more infrastructural. And more engaged with this kind of entangled times and histories. Because working as curator, you understand that you have to work with a very large aggregates of groups of people and networks and technologies, because there is no knowledge that is available for you to work with that kind of constellation. So you have to continuously converse and continuously work out the terms, because the dialects are multiple. These are not languages, So contemporary is very different from modernism, because modernism is a language with a military and it's very clear. The fundamentals are clear. Contemporary is dialects with very, very different kind of accretions, And so I think curatorial work will become a very, very significant practice in the coming time, and the intellectual labor of it will come through more and more. It will have to redefine itself and more explicitly work as serious intellectual labor work, and not just not publicly it is performed too much as within the 20th century trope of inclusion, exclusion, those kind of tropes. I think it's much more complex than this at play now.
Yeah. Omar, how would you respond to that? How do you see the role of the curator changing?
I mean, I think it's already changed, obviously. And the way that I've experienced it from an institutional perspective is that in an almost refreshing way, it has become much more collaborative. So I feel that I am, the artist in me is talking to the artist, and the theater practitioner in me is talking to the theater practitioner. It's a really more fluent conversation, because sometimes and often the case now, it's not that the resources are always less, but the mechanisms, even if it's such as social distancing, everything is being considered. And that requires a kind of lockstep involvement, which for me, as Jibesh said, it demands a different kind of intellectual rigor and knowledge, but also a kind of much more open emotional capacity to receive and to give criticism. And for me, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us. But sometimes when you work in institutions that are, very rigid in terms of their structures of funding, it can be more complex. But I think if one is patient with the process, I think we're moving into a much more generative, collaborative space.
Well, that all sounds very positive. We have one final question, and it's for Storm. It says, Storm, you said museums had a big learning curve. Is there anything we need to unlearn?
Wow. Yes. But I want to share this responsibility of this question with the fellow panelists, please. But just to kind of take a stab at it. How to do this? Making a new museum, kind of what do we replicate, and what do we, what's the mimetic processes like? What is a museum, and what do we model it alongside or to? And so kind of what do we bump up against, kind of in this process? And sometimes it's kind of very practical, and maybe it's anecdotal, but I'm telling you now. But when we opened the Atelier program and we invited artists into the museum, suddenly the systems that we've worked so hard to implement around kind of how objects come into the museum and how they're looked after, and kind of the regimes that, kind of control all of that. And suddenly you have an artist who is wanting to bring in a spray can, into the museum. And it sets off a whole set of like health and safety kind of alarm bells across the kind of spectrum of the institution, what makes this kind of institution. So while we're building a kind of rigidity around kind of special care, because we hope to get a loan from Tate Modern, we also at the same time kind of bump up against some of our other kind of like desires. Maybe that's not the answer that this person is kind of wanting to hear. But I also do think there's a kind of a mimicking of certain kind of behaviors within museums, or what museums look like, that I think we could certainly undo. But I realize also in this process of putting up this incredible exhibition of the Cape Town artists, I had to unlearn. I had to let go of any sense of like what my taste is and what's important and what's not, what is beautiful and what is not, because everybody had to be treated with as much respect as we possibly could muster, and equally so. So it does mean that when you handle something that I had to let go, and often also with the participants that we've had in panel discussions, there's huge kind of unlearnings that has to happen, because I've also been conditioned to perform and operate in forums like this and others to, kind of this particular kind of standard. So those are definitely aspects, and sorry, it's a little bit all over the place, but I hope it gives some kind of pointers to position.
I mean, it seems to me that what you're essentially saying is that what you need to unlearn is a kind of rigidity around rules and regulations, that you need to allow new stories in and new ways of making art and new ways of understanding the world in. Omar, what was that?
I was just going to say, the project that Storm and everybody at Zeit did, I have to say, is really inspiring. I didn't know about it. And it just made me think, we all work in context museums that, we want to get loans. We want to have these valuable works. We need to represent artists' work accurately. But what I think I'm missing as a curator is that messy project space where you can do whatever, no temperature control, don't worry about it. And I know that some institutions, have that, duality. And maybe it is about needing that duality, because we can't live our lives with some of what we've heard these days, around transport and the economy, the environment. Maybe we need to have some hybrid model.
Yeah, it needs a quick response unit or something.
Yeah.
Can I share an anecdote?
Please.
Oh, just about unlearning. I was in Gwangju Biennale once, and there was this dinner, like friends, but all kind of cosmopolitan in their make. So we were sitting and having in this beautiful small restaurant, and this whole thing, the performatively was that we have eaten it in New York, we have eaten it in this. The taste of the world is simple. That kind of homogeneity on which certain kind of cosmopolitan performance works. And the man who was running the restaurant, a small family restaurant, he gave us a dish, said that, why don't you all taste it? And you won't believe the dish was something that has from another planet. And it completely burst the table because nobody could consume it, because it had a certain... it had a fish which was cooked for a long duration, marinated and fermented in a way that is impossible. And I think that was my learning. That is that you unlearn the narrative of homogeneity and having understood the world, and then everything appears. So
wonderful. So Susanne, the final statement. What do we need to unlearn?
So maybe as a kind of synthesis of what you all said, one could maybe say we have to unlearn of whom we think we are, and of our prejudices and self-images and self-esteems. And to put it differently, what we have to learn is how to share, how to open up our brains, our minds, and how to share. I think sharing is something which could help us. The idea of sharing maybe would be helpful in this process.
I think sharing is a beautiful word to finish on, actually. So, gosh, we whipped through this hour. It's gone so quickly. I understand what you're saying about time, Javish. It's just gone. But it's been such a enjoyable and interesting and nourishing conversation, and I'm very grateful to have been invited to take part in it. And so, Javesh, Susanne, Omar, and Storm, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Happy
I'm good
birthday.
night. Happy.
Yes.
Bye, Susanne. Bye, Omar.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Tom.
Thank you
Bye,
very much.
Jennifer.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.